I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'll never forget the moment when Elena Rodriguez, CEO of Sterling Global Enterprises, looked across that gleaming conference table and said 5 words that shattered my world. "Could I have your autograph?" The silence that followed was deafening. My husband David's face went white as a sheet, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. The leather portfolio he'd been so confidently presenting slipped from his fingers and hit the mahogany table with a dull thud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 years I'd been treated like the invisible wife, the one who smiled politely at company events and stayed quiet during business discussions. That morning, David had actually asked me to serve coffee to his most important client, treating me like hired help in my own marriage. But Elena Rodriguez knew exactly who I was, and in that moment, everything David thought he understood about his wife came crashing down around him. The woman sitting across from us wasn't just any client. She controlled a technology empire worth $12 billion, and she was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of Seattle traffic 42 floors below. The real Sarah Mitchell, the one my husband never bothered to truly know, was about to emerge from the shadows. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, you'll understand what happened next. Let me take you back to where it all began, 6 months before that life-changing morning in the Glass Tower conference room. I was standing in our pristine Capitol Hill kitchen, watching David practice his presentation for what he claimed would be the deal of a lifetime. Our marriage had become a carefully choreographed performance where I played the supporting role to his leading man, and I'd almost convinced myself I was content with that arrangement. David Mitchell was everything Seattle's business community expected in a successful consultant. At 38, he commanded Mitchell and Associates with the kind of confidence that came from growing up as James Harrison's protege and eventual son-in-law. James had built the consulting firm from nothing, and when David married me 5 years ago, it seemed like the perfect succession plan. The problem was that David had inherited James's business acumen, but none of his genuine warmth or curiosity about people. Our house reflected David's personality perfectly: clean lines, expensive furniture, and absolutely no soul. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that appeared in architectural magazines, but felt cold to actually live in. I'd suggested adding personal touches over the years, maybe some artwork from local Seattle artists, or even photographs from our travels, but David always dismissed these ideas as clutter that would distract from the sophisticated aesthetic he'd cultivated. That particular morning, as autumn rain pelted our floor-to-ceiling windows, David was rehearsing his pitch for Sterling Global Enterprises. He'd been pursuing this account for 8 months, ever since Elena Rodriguez had relocated her company's North American headquarters to Seattle. The potential contract was worth $25 million over 3 years, enough to triple the size of Mitchell and Associates overnight. I'd been only half listening to his presentation, more focused on responding to emails on my laptop, when something he said caught my attention. David was describing his firm's expertise in biotechnology consulting, specifically their experience with pharmaceutical research and development protocols. I looked up from my screen, surprised by the confidence in his voice as he discussed topics I knew he'd never actually worked with. "Interesting approach to the FDA approval process," I commented casually, not really thinking about the implications of my observation. David paused mid-sentence, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "What would you know about FDA approvals, Sarah?" he asked, his tone carrying that particular condescension I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "You majored in literature, remember?" The dismissal stung, but not because it was particularly cruel. David had never been deliberately mean to me. He simply had a way of making me feel small and irrelevant, as if my thoughts and experiences existed in a completely different universe from his important business world. What hurt was how automatically he discounted my input, how quickly he assumed I couldn't possibly understand something he was discussing. I closed my laptop and began clearing the breakfast dishes, a routine that had become as familiar as breathing. David continued his presentation practice, but I noticed him stumbling over the technical sections he'd been so confident about moments before. He kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and suspicion, as if he was trying to figure out why I'd made that comment about FDA protocols. Our marriage had settled into this pattern of polite distance over the past 2 years. We attended social functions together, maintained our beautiful home, and presented the image of a successful Seattle power couple. David's friends and colleagues saw us as the perfect match, the ambitious businessman and his devoted wife, who supported his career aspirations. What they didn't see was how lonely it felt to be married to someone who had no real interest in who I was beyond my role in his carefully constructed life. I'd met David at a University of Washington alumni event, 4 years before we married. He'd been immediately charming, confident in that way that successful men often are when they've never really been challenged or disappointed by life. He talked about his vision for expanding his father-in-law's consulting firm, his plans for making Mitchell and Associates a major player in Seattle's competitive business landscape. I was drawn to his ambition and the way he seemed to have everything figured out. What I didn't realize then was that David's attraction to me was largely based on what I represented, rather than who I actually was. I came from a respectable family, had graduated with honors from a prestigious university, and possessed the kind of understated elegance that would complement his professional image. I was in many ways the perfect accessory for the life he was building, and I'd gradually allowed myself to become exactly that. The morning of the Sterling Global meeting, David spent extra time choosing his tie and adjusting his cufflinks. He'd been talking about this presentation for weeks, explaining how landing Elena Rodriguez as a client would establish Mitchell and Associates as a serious player in the technology consulting space.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The nervousness underneath his usual confidence was palpable, and I found myself feeling genuinely hopeful that this opportunity would work out for him. As we drove downtown through Seattle's morning traffic, David outlined his strategy for the meeting. Elena Rodriguez had a reputation for being brilliant but demanding, someone who expected her consultants to understand her business as well as she did. David had spent months researching Sterling Global's operations, studying their recent acquisitions and expansion plans, preparing for every possible question she might ask. The Glass Tower in Belltown was one of Seattle's most impressive office buildings, its reflective surface catching the morning light in a way that made it seem to glow against the overcast sky. As we rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, I caught our reflection in the polished steel doors. David looked every inch the successful consultant in his perfectly tailored suit and confident posture. I appeared exactly as I was supposed to, the supportive wife, professionally dressed but not competing for attention, present but not presumptuous. Mitchell and Associates occupied a corner suite with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. Victoria Sterling, David's assistant, greeted us with her usual professional warmth. She'd been with the company for 6 years and had always been kind to me, though I suspected she sometimes wondered why I didn't take a more active interest in David's business. Victoria led us to the main conference room, where David began setting up his presentation materials with the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. The conference room was David's pride and joy, with its massive mahogany table, leather chairs, and state-of-the-art audio-visual equipment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of the city and water, providing a backdrop that was meant to impress potential clients and reinforce Mitchell and Associates' success and sophistication. David had spent considerable time and money creating this space, understanding that in consulting, perception often mattered as much as actual capability. As we waited for Elena Rodriguez to arrive, David reviewed his notes one final time. I sat quietly in one of the chairs along the wall, the designated spot for spouses who were present but not participating. It was a role I'd grown comfortable with over the years, the dutiful wife who provided moral support without getting in the way of important business discussions. David occasionally glanced in my direction, offering reassuring smiles that suggested he appreciated my presence even if he didn't require my input. When Elena Rodriguez entered the conference room at exactly 9 o'clock, I understood immediately why David had been so nervous about this meeting. She possessed the kind of commanding presence that filled a room without any apparent effort. Tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room she entered. Her assistant Michael Torres followed closely behind, carrying a sleek tablet and maintaining the hyper-aware posture of someone whose job required anticipating his boss's every need. David rose to greet them, his professional charm on full display, as he offered his hand and expressed his appreciation for Elena's time. She responded with polite professionalism, but I noticed her eyes scanning the room, taking in details with the systematic thoroughness of someone who missed very little. When her gaze briefly met mine, I offered a small smile and nod, expecting the standard acknowledgement reserved for spouses at business meetings. Instead, Elena's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There was a moment of what looked like recognition, followed quickly by confusion, as if she was trying to place me in a context that didn't quite make sense. She recovered quickly, turning her attention back to David as he began outlining the agenda for their meeting, but I caught her glancing in my direction several more times during the introductory pleasantries. The first hour of the meeting proceeded exactly as David had planned. He presented Mitchell and Associates' background and capabilities with polished professionalism, highlighting their success with previous clients and their understanding of Sterling Global's unique challenges. Elena listened attentively, asking pointed questions that demonstrated her thorough preparation and deep understanding of her own business needs. David handled her inquiries well, displaying the competence and confidence that had made him successful in Seattle's competitive consulting market. It was during the break, as David stepped out to take a phone call, that everything began to shift in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Elena excused herself from the conference table and approached the windows, ostensibly to admire the view of Elliott Bay. After a moment, she turned to me with a directness that was both surprising and slightly unsettling. "You look very familiar," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "Have we met before? Perhaps at a conference or industry event?" "I don't think so," I replied, though I had the strange sensation that she was right about the familiarity. There was something about her presence that felt oddly comfortable, as if we'd had this conversation before. "I would definitely remember meeting you, Miss Rodriguez. Your reputation in the technology industry is quite impressive." She studied my face for another moment, then returned to her seat as David re-entered the room. But throughout the remainder of the presentation, I noticed her attention dividing between David's carefully prepared slides and whatever puzzle she was trying to solve about my identity. The feeling of being watched with such focused intensity was both flattering and unnerving, especially since I couldn't understand what had captured her interest. David's presentation concluded with a comprehensive proposal for how Mitchell and Associates could help Sterling Global navigate their planned expansion into the biotechnology sector. It was ambitious and well-researched, demonstrating David's considerable skills as a business strategist. Elena asked several follow-up questions, each one more detailed and technical than the last, probing the depth of his firm's expertise in areas that would be crucial to her company's success. As the formal presentation ended, Elena seemed to reach some kind of internal decision. She looked directly at David and said, "I'm impressed with your firm's capabilities, Mr. Mitchell. However, I have some additional questions about your biotechnology expertise. Specifically, I'd like to understand your experience with FDA regulatory protocols and pharmaceutical development timelines." It was exactly the kind of detailed technical discussion that David had prepared for, but as he began to respond, I could see him struggling slightly with the specifics. His answers were confident but somewhat general, lacking the precise technical knowledge that Elena's questions demanded. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Elena pressing for more detailed information while David worked to maintain his authoritative demeanor. Finally, Elena turned to me with an expression that seemed almost mischievous. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've been very patient during our lengthy business discussion. I hope you haven't been too bored by all this technical talk about regulatory compliance and pharmaceutical development." There was something in her tone that suggested she was testing me, though I couldn't understand why. David immediately responded for me, explaining that I wasn't involved in the business side of his firm and wouldn't be familiar with these specialized topics. His protective intervention was typical, but something about Elena's continued attention made me feel like I was missing an important piece of a larger puzzle. That's when Elena Rodriguez did something that changed everything. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out what appeared to be a scientific journal, though I couldn't see the cover from my position across the room. She placed it on the conference table and looked directly at me with an expression that combined respect, curiosity, and something that might have been amusement. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said slowly, "I wonder if you might be willing to help me with something. I have a document here that I'd very much like you to sign." The request was so unexpected that both David and I stared at her in confusion. David recovered first, his protective instincts immediately engaging as he questioned why Elena would want his wife's signature on any document related to their business discussion. Elena's response was to open the journal and turn it toward me, revealing a page that made my breath catch in my throat. It was my photograph, accompanying an article I'd authored 3 years earlier for the Journal of Biotechnology Innovation. The headline read, "Revolutionary Approaches to FDA Approval Processes, a Case Study in Pharmaceutical Development Efficiency." Below my photo was my maiden name, Dr. Sarah Chen, and a brief biography describing my work as Chief Innovation Officer for Phoenix Innovations, a biotechnology consulting firm that had been acquired by a major pharmaceutical company for $450 million. The silence in the conference room was absolute. David stared at the journal page as if it were written in a foreign language, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been betrayal. Elena watched both of us, with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Could I have your autograph, Dr. Chen?" Elena asked again, her voice carrying a mixture of professional respect and personal amusement. "I've been following your work for years, and your insights into regulatory optimization have revolutionized how we approach pharmaceutical development at Sterling Global. I had no idea you were married to Mr. Mitchell, or I would have requested this meeting with you directly." The world seemed to tilt slightly as I realized that everything I'd carefully buried about my previous life was suddenly, impossibly, sitting open on the conference table in front of my husband. The woman I used to be, the successful biotechnology consultant who had built and sold a company, was staring back at me from the pages of a prestigious scientific journal. And David, the man I'd been married to for 5 years, was learning about this part of my identity for the very first time. The aftermath of Elena Rodriguez's request hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. David's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the journal, his eyes scanning the page with the desperate intensity of someone trying to decode a message that would explain how his entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. The woman sitting beside him, the woman he'd married, the woman he'd asked to serve coffee that morning, was apparently one of the most respected biotechnology consultants in the Pacific Northwest. Elena observed this domestic drama unfolding with the detached fascination of someone watching a particularly compelling play. She'd clearly orchestrated this revelation with surgical precision, and now she was waiting to see how the pieces would fall. Michael Torres, her assistant, maintained his professional composure, though I caught him stealing glances at the tension crackling between David and me. "Dr. Sarah Chen," David repeated slowly, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "Chief Innovation Officer at Phoenix Innovations." He looked up from the journal, his face a mixture of hurt and bewilderment. "Sarah, what is this? Why don't I know about any of this?" The question hung between us, loaded with 5 years of marriage, and assumptions that were now crumbling in real time. I could see him trying to reconcile the woman he thought he'd married with this stranger, who apparently had a doctorate in biotechnology and had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The cognitive dissonance was written across his features, and for the first time in our relationship, I was seeing David Mitchell genuinely vulnerable and confused. "It's complicated," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, but how do you explain to your husband that you'd deliberately hidden the most significant part of your professional identity? How do you tell someone you love that you'd been living as half a person, because it seemed easier than dealing with their reaction to your full self? Elena Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from amusement to something more serious. "Perhaps I should give you both some privacy to discuss this," she offered, though her tone suggested she was curious about how this revelation would play out. "This clearly involves personal matters that go beyond our business discussion." "No," David said quickly, his professional instincts overriding his personal confusion. He was struggling to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage, but he wasn't ready to abandon the most important business meeting of his career. "We can discuss this later. Please, Miss Rodriguez, let's continue with why you're interested in working with Mitchell and Associates." Elena studied both of us for a moment, then made a decision that would reshape everything about the conversation we'd been having. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about why I'm here today." She turned her attention to me, her voice taking on the respectful tone reserved for professional equals. "Dr. Chen, I didn't come to Seattle to discuss hiring Mitchell and Associates. I came here specifically to recruit you." The words hit David like a physical blow. I watched the color drain from his face as he processed what Elena was actually saying. She hadn't been considering his firm for the Sterling Global contract. She'd been pursuing his wife, the woman he'd asked to serve coffee that morning, the woman whose professional expertise he'd dismissed without a second thought. You see, Elena continued, addressing both of us, but clearly focusing on me. Sterling Global is planning a major expansion into biotechnology development. We're looking to establish partnerships with pharmaceutical companies and research institutions, and we need someone with your specific expertise to lead that initiative. Your work on regulatory optimization could save our industry millions of dollars and years of development time. I stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was offering. After 3 years of complete professional invisibility, of attending David's business events as the silent spouse, of allowing my expertise to atrophy while I played the role of the supportive wife, Elena Rodriguez was offering me a chance to return to the world where my knowledge and experience actually mattered. David found his voice again, though it came out strained and uncertain. Sarah doesn't work in biotechnology anymore. She left that field when we got married. He looked at me as if seeking confirmation of this statement, but also as if he was beginning to doubt everything he thought he knew about our relationship. Is that true, Dr. Chen? Elena asked, her tone suggesting she suspected there was more to the story. Did you voluntarily leave biotechnology, or were there other factors that influenced that decision? The question forced me to confront the careful fiction I'd constructed around my career transition. The truth was that I hadn't exactly left biotechnology by choice. I'd allowed myself to be gradually pushed away from it, partly by David's subtle but persistent suggestions that my work was too demanding and stressful, partly by my own desire to avoid conflict in our marriage, and partly by the exhaustion that came from constantly having to prove my worth in a relationship where my professional identity seemed to make my husband uncomfortable. When David and I got married, I explained carefully, choosing my words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. It seemed like a good time to explore other opportunities. Phoenix Innovations had been acquired, and I was ready for a change. It was technically true, but it omitted the crucial context that would explain why I'd been willing to walk away from a career I'd spent a decade building. David had never explicitly asked me to leave biotechnology, but he'd made it clear through countless small comments and reactions that my professional success was somehow threatening to his vision of our marriage. It was easier to step back than to fight about it constantly. Elena Rodriguez was too experienced and perceptive to miss the careful diplomacy in my response. She leaned back in her chair, her expression suggesting she understood exactly what I wasn't saying. In my experience, she said slowly, brilliant scientists don't just lose interest in their field overnight, particularly when they're at the peak of their success. The observation hung in the air like an accusation, though Elena's tone remained professionally neutral. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps beginning to realize that his wife's career transition might not have been as voluntary as he'd believed. For my part, I felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Someone was finally acknowledging that my professional disappearance had been a loss, not just a lifestyle choice. Michael Torres had been silently observing this exchange, and now he spoke for the first time since entering the conference room. Dr. Chen, your research on pharmaceutical development protocols has been cited in over 200 academic papers. Your work is still considered the gold standard for regulatory compliance in biotechnology. That kind of expertise doesn't just disappear. His comment was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth, but it landed like a bomb in the increasingly tense atmosphere of the conference room. David stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, trying to reconcile this new information with the woman who'd been serving him coffee that morning. 200 citations, he repeated, his voice barely audible. Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me about any of this? The question revealed the depth of the chasm that had opened between us. How could I explain that I had tried to share my professional accomplishments with him in the early days of our relationship, only to see his eyes glaze over or watch him change the subject? How could I tell him that I'd learned to downplay my expertise, because his discomfort with my success was so obvious that it poisoned every conversation we tried to have about my work? You never asked, I said simply, and the words contained more truth than I'd intended to reveal. Elena Rodriguez had been watching this marital drama unfold with the sharp attention of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. Now she made another strategic decision that would further destabilize the careful equilibrium David and I had maintained in our relationship. Dr. Chen, she said, reaching into her briefcase again, I'd like you to see something that might interest you. She extracted a thick folder and placed it on the conference table. These are the preliminary research proposals for Sterling Global's biotechnology initiative. We've had our best scientists working on these protocols for 6 months, but they're struggling with some of the regulatory compliance issues that you solved so elegantly in your Phoenix Innovations work. She opened the folder, revealing documents dense with scientific terminology and regulatory frameworks. I found myself leaning forward involuntarily, drawn to the familiar language of pharmaceutical development and FDA protocols. Despite 3 years away from active practice, my mind immediately began processing the information, identifying potential solutions to the problems Elena's team was facing. David watched me scan the documents, and I could see him registering my obvious familiarity with material that was completely foreign to him. For the first time in our marriage, he was seeing me in my element, watching me engage with work that challenged and excited me in ways that his business consulting never had. This approach to phase 2 trials is inefficient, I found myself saying, pointing to a section of the research proposal. You could accelerate the timeline by 18 months if you restructured the patient recruitment protocols and implemented parallel processing for the regulatory submissions. The words came out before I could stop them, my professional instincts overriding the careful restraint I'd practiced for years. Elena smiled with satisfaction, while David stared at me as if I'd just started
Speaking in a foreign language. Exactly what our team concluded, Elena said, but they couldn't figure out how to implement those changes without compromising the quality of the data collection. How would you solve that problem? I found myself explaining the solution in detail, drawing on years of experience with pharmaceutical development and regulatory compliance. As I spoke, I could feel my confidence returning, the professional competence I'd buried reasserting itself in the face of a genuine intellectual challenge. It was intoxicating to use my mind fully again, to engage with problems that required the depth of knowledge I'd spent decades accumulating. When I finished my explanation, the conference room was silent except for the distant hum of Seattle traffic far below. Elena Rodriguez was nodding with obvious approval, while Michael Torres was taking notes on his tablet. David, meanwhile, was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between admiration and devastation. That solution could save Sterling Global approximately $40 million in development costs, Elena said quietly. Dr. Chen, I'd like to offer you a position as Senior Vice President of Biotechnology Development, reporting directly to me. The salary would be $800,000 annually, plus equity participation and comprehensive benefits. The number hit the room like a thunderclap. David's annual income from Mitchell & Associates was roughly $200,000, a respectable sum that had provided us with a comfortable lifestyle in Seattle. Elena Rodriguez was offering me 4 times that amount, plus equity in a company worth $12 billion. But the money wasn't what made my heart race. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement that my expertise had value, that I could contribute something meaningful to the world beyond serving coffee at my husband's business meetings. For 3 years, I'd been living as a shadow of myself, and Elena was offering me a chance to step back into the light. David finally found his voice again, though it came out strained and uncertain. Sarah, this is all very sudden. Don't you think you should consider this carefully before making any decisions? His words carried the weight of 5 years of marriage. 5 years of him making decisions about our life together, without consulting me about my own professional aspirations. There was a pleading quality to his voice that I'd never heard before, as if he was beginning to understand that our relationship had been built on foundations that were less solid than he'd believed. Elena Rodriguez gathered the research documents and returned them to her folder. Dr. Chen, I understand this is a significant decision that affects your personal life as well as your professional future. Why don't you take some time to think about it? We could schedule another meeting for next week to discuss the details. She stood to leave, her assistant following suit. As she reached the conference room door, she turned back to address both of us. Mr. Mitchell, I want to thank you for facilitating this introduction to your wife. This meeting has been far more productive than I anticipated, though perhaps not in the way you originally expected. The comment was delivered with professional courtesy, but it contained an unmistakable acknowledgement that the entire purpose of the meeting had shifted. David had spent months pursuing Elena Rodriguez as a client for his consulting firm. Instead, she'd ended up recruiting his wife for a position that would transform not just my career, but the entire dynamic of our marriage. After Elena and Michael left, David and I sat in the conference room in stunned silence. The morning had begun with him practicing his presentation and me checking emails, a routine domestic scene that had revealed nothing unusual. Now we were sitting across from each other like streamers trying to process revelations that had fundamentally altered our understanding of who we were as individuals and as a couple. David was the first to break the silence. Sarah, I need you to help me understand what just happened. How is it possible that I've been married to you for 5 years and never knew about any of this? His voice carried genuine bewilderment, but also an undercurrent of hurt that I recognized as justified. Whatever my reasons for hiding my professional background, the fact remained that I'd built our marriage on an incomplete version of myself. I'd allowed him to believe that I was someone I wasn't, or rather, someone I was no longer. When we met, I began slowly. I was already burned out from the intensity of building Phoenix Innovations. The acquisition had been stressful, and I was ready for a break from the biotechnology world. When you talked about your vision for our life together, it seemed like an opportunity to try something different. It was a careful explanation that contained elements of truth while avoiding the more complicated reality of how I'd gradually allowed myself to be diminished in our relationship. The truth was that David's vision of our life together had never included space for my professional ambitions. He'd been attracted to the idea of a wife who would support his career without competing for attention or success. But you have a doctorate, he said. His voice rising slightly. You built a company that sold for almost $500 million. Sarah, you're apparently one of the most respected experts in your field. How do you just walk away from all of that? The question forced me to confront the choices I'd made, the gradual erosion of my professional identity that I'd allowed to happen in the name of marital harmony. Looking back, I could see the pattern clearly. David's subtle but persistent messages that my work was too demanding, too stressful, too consuming. His suggestions that I deserved a break, that I should explore other interests, that our marriage would be stronger if I focused more on our relationship and less on my career. At the time, his concern had seemed loving and supportive. He was worried about my stress levels, he said. He wanted me to be happy and fulfilled. He thought I was working too hard and sacrificing my personal life for professional success. It had taken me years to recognize that his concern was really about his own discomfort with having a wife whose career overshadowed his own. I thought I wanted something different. I said finally, I thought I wanted a simpler life, one that didn't revolve around regulatory deadlines and pharmaceutical development timelines. I thought I wanted to be the kind of wife who could focus on supporting her husband's career instead of competing with it. The words revealed more than I'd intended, acknowledging the fundamental tension that had shaped our marriage from the beginning. David stared at me, perhaps beginning to understand that my professional withdrawal hadn't been entirely voluntary. Is that what you thought our marriage was about? He asked quietly. Competition, the question hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us was quite ready to explore. Our marriage hadn't been about conscious competition, but it had been shaped by David's unconscious need to be the more successful partner, the one whose career took priority when decisions needed to be made about our life together. I looked out the conference room windows at the Seattle skyline, thinking about the choice Elena Rodriguez had presented to me. For 3 years I'd been living as David Mitchell's wife, the woman who attended his business events, and smiled politely during conversations about consulting strategies I found mind-numbingly boring. Now I was being offered a chance to return to work that challenged and excited me, work that could make a meaningful difference in the world. But accepting Elena's offer would mean more than just changing careers. It would mean fundamentally altering the balance of power in my marriage, stepping back into a professional identity that might threaten everything David and I had built together. The woman who could solve pharmaceutical development problems worth millions of dollars was very different from the woman who served coffee at business meetings. David seemed to be having similar thoughts. Sarah, if you take this job with Sterling Global, what happens to us? What happens to our marriage? It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of everything that was wrong with our relationship. The fact that he saw my professional success as a threat to our marriage revealed how fragile the foundation we'd built really was. A strong marriage should be able to withstand both partners being successful. The fact that ours couldn't suggested deeper problems than either of us had been willing to acknowledge. I don't know, I admitted, but David, I don't know what happens to us if I don't take it either. I don't know if I can go back to pretending that this part of me doesn't exist. The admission hung in the air between us, acknowledging that our marriage had been built on a fundamental deception. Not a malicious one, perhaps, but a deception nonetheless. I'd allowed David to believe that I was content being a supporting character in his story, when the truth was that I'd simply been too tired and discouraged to follow my own narrative. Now Elena Rodriguez had reminded me that I had my own story to tell, my own contributions to make to the world. The question was whether David and I could find a way to write our stories together, or whether the revelation of who I really was would be the beginning of the end of everything we'd tried to build. The drive home from downtown Seattle felt like traveling through a different city entirely. The familiar landmarks looked the same, but everything felt altered by the morning's revelations. David gripped the steering wheel with unusual intensity, his knuckles white against the black leather, as we navigated the late morning traffic back to Capitol Hill. Neither of us had spoken since leaving the glass tower, the silence in the car heavy with unasked questions and unspoken truths. I found myself studying my husband's profile as he concentrated on the road, trying to reconcile this man I'd lived with for 5 years, with someone who apparently knew so little about who I really was. The carefully controlled expression he wore was one I recognized from business situations, where he felt uncertain but needed to project confidence. Except now that professional mask was being applied to our marriage, and the distance it created felt insurmountable. When we pulled into our driveway, David sat for a moment without turning off the engine, staring at our house as if seeing it for the first time. The perfectly manicured lawn and architectural magazine aesthetic that had once seemed sophisticated now felt sterile and cold, like a stage set designed to impress, rather than a home where people actually lived their authentic lives. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. The words carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid during our marriage, all the conversations we'd avoided in favor of maintaining the polite fiction that we understood each other completely. Inside the house, we gravitated toward the living room, though neither of us seemed comfortable settling into our usual spots on the pristine white sofa. Instead, we stood near the windows overlooking our backyard, the physical distance between us, reflecting the emotional chasm that had opened during the morning's meeting. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing stress. "Sarah, I keep trying to understand how we got here. How did I not know that my wife is apparently one of the most successful biotechnology consultants in the country?" The question revealed the depth of his confusion, but also something else that made my chest tighten with a mixture of guilt and resentment. He was focusing on my professional credentials, the external markers of success that he could quantify and understand. What he wasn't asking about was why I'd felt the need to hide that part of myself from him in the first place. "You never seemed interested in the details of my previous work," I said carefully. "When we were dating, whenever I talked about Phoenix Innovations, or my research, you'd get this look on your face like you were trying to be polite about something boring." Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. David's expression shifted, and I could see him replaying conversations from our early relationship, perhaps recognizing patterns he'd never noticed before. "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was always supportive of your career." "Supportive," I repeated, testing the word. "David, when we got engaged, you suggested that the stress of my job was affecting my health. You said I seemed happier when I wasn't working such long hours. You kept talking about how nice it would be if I could find something less demanding." The memories came flooding back as I spoke, moments I'd buried or reinterpreted to maintain the fiction that our relationship was built on mutual respect and understanding. David's concern about my work habits had seemed loving at the time, but now I could see it for what it really was: discomfort with having a partner whose professional life was more demanding and lucrative than his own. "I was worried about you," David said, his defensive tone revealing that he was beginning to understand the implications of my words. "You were working 70-hour weeks, constantly stressed about deadlines and regulatory issues. I thought you deserved better than that. Better than work that challenged and fulfilled me." I asked, feeling a spark of anger that I'd been suppressing for years. "Better than using my education and expertise to make meaningful contributions to pharmaceutical development." "David, what you thought I deserved was to be a different person entirely." The accusation hung between us, more honest than any conversation we'd had in years. David stared at me as if I were a stranger, which in many ways I suppose I was. The woman he'd married had been a carefully edited version of myself, designed to fit into his vision of what a wife should be. "That's not fair," he said, but his protest lacked energy. I never asked you to give up your career entirely. I just thought you might want to explore other options, find something that gave you more work-life balance. Work-life balance, I repeated, recognizing the corporate euphemism for what it really meant in the context of our marriage. You mean find work that wouldn't interfere with your career advancement? Something that would let me be the supportive spouse you needed without competing for attention or success. David sank into one of the armchairs, the fight going out of him as he perhaps began to recognize the truth in my words. Sarah, I never meant for you to feel like you couldn't be successful. I just wanted us to build a life together, where we were both happy. But your version of happiness required me to be smaller than I actually am, I said, the words coming out with more force than I'd intended. Your version of a life together meant I should be content organizing charity events and attending business dinners where I smile politely while other people discuss work that I could probably do better than any of them. The admission revealed how much resentment I'd been carrying, how the gradual erosion of my professional identity had affected not just my career, but my sense of self-worth. For 3 years I'd been living as a supporting character in David's story, and I'd almost convinced myself that it was enough. David looked up at me with an expression that combined hurt and bewilderment. I thought you were happy, he said quietly. You never complained about any of this. You seemed content with our life together. Because I loved you, I replied, feeling tears threaten for the first time since the morning's revelations. Because I wanted our marriage to work, and it seemed like the only way to make that happen was to become the person you needed me to be. The words revealed the fundamental dysfunction at the heart of our relationship. Love shouldn't require one person to diminish themselves for the other's comfort. A marriage shouldn't be built on one partner hiding essential parts of their identity to avoid conflict. My phone buzzed with a text message, breaking the tension that had been building between us. I glanced at the screen and saw Rachel Thompson's name, my closest friend and one of the few people who knew about my previous career in biotechnology. Lunch today, the message read. I have news that will either excite you or terrify you, possibly both. Rachel had been my roommate during graduate school and had remained my closest confidant throughout the years when I'd gradually withdrawn from professional life. She worked as a research director at the University of Washington and had never quite understood my decision to step away from biotechnology. Her perspective on my marriage was complicated by her genuine affection for David combined with her obvious frustration with my professional choices. I need to meet Rachel for lunch, I told David, grateful for an excuse to escape the suffocating atmosphere of our house and the weight of conversations we'd been avoiding for years. David nodded, perhaps equally relieved to have some time to process the morning's revelations. Sarah, before you go, can I ask you something? If Elena Rodriguez offers you this position, are you seriously considering taking it? The question revealed his hope that the morning's events might somehow be contained, that we could return to our previous equilibrium, if I simply declined Elena's offer and pretended this conversation had never happened. But the cat was out of the bag now, and there was no way to stuff it back in. I don't know, I said honestly. 3 hours ago, I thought I was content with my life. Now I'm discovering that I've been living as half a person for the past 3 years. I need time to figure out what that means. Café Luna in the University District had been Rachel's and my regular meeting spot since graduate school, a comfortable space filled with mismatched furniture, and the comfortable chaos of students and faculty engaged in animated discussions about research and academic politics. The familiar environment felt like a refuge after the sterile perfection of our house, and the emotional minefield of my marriage. Rachel was already waiting when I arrived, her red hair pulled back in the messy bun that was her standard professional look, surrounded by the inevitable stack of academic papers that accompanied her everywhere. She looked up as I approached, and I could see her registering the strain on my face. You look like someone who's had an interesting morning, she observed, pushing aside her research materials to make room for me at the small table. Let me guess, David finally realized he's married to a brilliant scientist instead of a decorative housewife. Rachel had never been subtle about her opinions regarding my marriage. She'd watched me gradually withdraw from biotechnology with increasing frustration, and her comments about David were carefully diplomatic but unmistakably critical. Something like that, I said, settling into the chair across from her. Rachel, what would you say if I told you that Elena Rodriguez, the CEO of Sterling Global, just offered me a position as Senior Vice President of Biotechnology Development? Rachel's eyes widened, and she set down her coffee cup with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer. Elena Rodriguez. Sarah, she's basically the most powerful woman in the technology industry. How did you even meet her? I explained the morning's events, watching Rachel's expression cycle through amazement, vindication, and something that looked like relief. When I finished describing Elena's offer, Rachel sat back in her chair and stared at me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. $800,000 annually, she repeated slowly. Plus equity in a $12 billion company. Sarah, do you understand what this means? This isn't just a job offer. This is Elena Rodriguez, acknowledging that you're one of the most valuable biotechnology consultants in the world. I know, I said, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the opportunity. But Rachel, what about David? What about our marriage? If I take this position, everything changes. Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. Sarah, I'm going to say something that might be difficult to hear, but I think it needs to be said. Your marriage has been built on you making yourself smaller so that David can feel bigger. That's not love. That's not partnership. That's you sacrificing your potential for his comfort. The words hit harder because they came from someone who'd known me before I met David. Someone who remembered who I'd been when I was fully engaged with my work and confident in my abilities. Rachel had watched me gradually dim my own light to avoid outshining my husband, and she'd never understood why I thought that was necessary. But we've built a life together, I protested, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure what exactly we'd built beyond the appearance of success and compatibility. You've built a life where you pretend to be someone you're not. Rachel corrected, that's not the same thing. Sarah, when was the last time you felt genuinely excited about something? When was the last time you used your mind to its full capacity? The questions forced me to confront how intellectually starved I'd become. The morning's discussion with Elena Rodriguez had reminded me of what it felt like to engage with complex problems, to use my expertise to solve meaningful challenges. For 3 years, the most stimulating part of my day had been organizing social events, or reading about other people's research achievements. This morning, I admitted, when Elena showed me those research proposals, I felt alive in a way I haven't experienced in years. It was like remembering how to breathe after holding your breath for too long. Rachel nodded with satisfaction. That's what I thought. Sarah, you're 41 years old. You have at least 20 more years of productive career ahead of you. Are you really going to spend them serving coffee at your husband's business meetings? The blunt assessment stung because it was accurate. I'd allowed myself to become professionally invisible, and the cost of that invisibility was becoming clear only now that I was being offered an alternative. But what if David can't handle it? I asked, what if this destroys our marriage? Rachel's expression softened slightly. Sarah, if your marriage can't survive you being successful, then it was never as strong as you thought it was. A partnership should make both people stronger, not require one person to weaken themselves for the other's benefit. Her words echoed thoughts I'd been having but hadn't been willing to acknowledge. The revelation of my hidden professional identity had exposed fundamental problems in my marriage that went far beyond career consideration. David and I had built our relationship on assumptions about who we were supposed to be, rather than accepting who we actually were. There's something else, Rachel said, reaching into her bag and extracting a manila folder. Remember how I said I had news that would either excite or terrify you? She slid the folder across the table. The National Science Foundation is funding a major new biotechnology research initiative, and they've specifically requested that I recommend candidates for the director position. Guess whose name is at the top of my list? I opened the folder to find a detailed description of a research program focused on accelerating pharmaceutical development through improved regulatory processes. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been doing at Phoenix Innovations, the intersection of scientific research and practical application that had made my career so rewarding. The funding is $30 million over 5 years, Rachel continued. It would be based here in Seattle, with partnerships at major research universities across the country. Sarah, this could be your chance to return to biotechnology on your own terms, without having to work for someone else's company. The opportunity was staggering, but
but it also felt overwhelming after years of professional dormancy. Could I really step back into that world after so much time away? Did I still have the confidence and expertise to lead a major research initiative? I don't know if I'm ready for something this significant, I said, though even as I spoke, I could feel my mind beginning to engage with the possibilities the program offered. You're ready, Rachel said firmly. You were ready 3 years ago when you walked away from your career, and you're definitely ready now. The question isn't whether you can do this work. The question is whether you're finally ready to stop hiding from who you really are. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us contemplating the implications of the choices I was facing. Two different paths back to professional relevance. Two opportunities to reclaim the identity I'd buried in favor of marital harmony. But both would require me to confront the fundamental problems in my marriage and decide whether David and I could find a way forward together. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and I hesitated before answering, not sure I was ready to continue the conversation we'd started at home. Sarah, where are you? His voice carried an urgency I didn't recognize. I need you to come home. We have a situation. What kind of situation? I asked, immediately concerned. Elena Rodriguez called. She wants to schedule a follow-up meeting for tomorrow morning, but that's not the important part. Sarah, she mentioned your work to some colleagues, and apparently word is spreading through the biotechnology community that Dr. Sarah Chen is back. I've had 3 phone calls in the past hour from companies wanting to discuss potential consulting opportunities. The information hit me like a physical force. In the space of a few hours, my carefully buried professional identity was being resurrected, not just by Elena Rodriguez, but by the broader biotechnology community. The skills and expertise I'd thought were safely hidden were suddenly in demand again. David, I said slowly, are you okay with this? There was a long pause before he answered. I don't know, but Sarah, I'm beginning to understand that what I'm okay with might not be the most important consideration anymore. We need to talk about what you want, not just what works for our marriage. The admission revealed a shift in his thinking that I hadn't expected. Perhaps the morning's revelations had forced him to confront the selfishness that had shaped our relationship, the way he'd unconsciously prioritized his comfort over my fulfillment. I'll be home in 20 minutes, I told him, ending the call and turning back to Rachel. Sounds like the decision might be making itself, she observed with a small smile. Sarah, whatever you choose, make sure it's what you actually want, not what you think you should want. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Seattle, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been before I met David, the confident scientist who'd built a successful company and contributed meaningful research to her field. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I'd known in another lifetime, but she was still part of me, still waiting to emerge from the shadows where I'd hidden her. The question was whether I was finally ready to let her out. The house felt different when I returned from lunch with Rachel, as if the morning's revelations had somehow altered the molecular composition of the air itself. David was pacing in the living room, his phone in one hand and a notepad covered
in his precise handwriting in the other. He looked up when I entered, and I could see the stress lines around his eyes had deepened since I'd left. 3 more calls, he said without preamble. Meridian Capital wants to discuss a biotechnology consulting contract worth $2 million. Northwest Medical Research is interested in hiring you as their chief scientific officer, and someone from the Journal of Biotechnology Innovation wants to interview you about returning to active research. The cascade of opportunities felt surreal after 3 years of professional invisibility. Word was spreading through the biotechnology community with the speed that only gossip about brilliant minds could achieve. Apparently, Dr. Sarah Chen's potential return to the field was significant enough news to generate immediate interest from major players in the industry. David set down his phone and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between resignation and genuine curiosity. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. During our entire marriage, have you been pretending to be someone you're not? The question cut straight to the heart of everything that was wrong between us. I could have deflected or softened the truth, but the morning's events had stripped away my ability to maintain comfortable fictions. Yes, I said simply. Not entirely, but yes. I've been pretending that I was content being the supportive wife who didn't have her own professional ambitions. David absorbed this admission with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language they'd never heard before. And you did this because you thought I couldn't handle being married to someone more successful than me? The question revealed that he was beginning to understand the dynamics that had shaped our relationship, even if acknowledging them was painful. I did it because every time I talked about my work, you found ways to change the subject or suggest that I was working too hard. I did it because it seemed like the only way to make our marriage work was to make myself smaller. David walked to the windows overlooking our backyard, his shoulders carrying the weight of recognizing his own behavior in my words. I never consciously tried to diminish you, he said quietly, but I'm starting to see that impact matters more than intention. The admission marked a shift in his understanding that gave me hope for the first time in hours. Perhaps this crisis could become an opportunity for us to build something more authentic together, if we were both willing to do the difficult work of acknowledging who we really were. My phone rang, Elena Rodriguez's name appearing on the screen. David nodded toward the device. You should take it. We both need to hear what she has to say. Dr. Chen? Elena's voice carried the warm professionalism that had impressed me that morning. I hope you've had time to consider our discussion. I'm calling because I've been thinking about how we might structure this opportunity to make it as appealing as possible for you. She went on to explain that Sterling Global was prepared to offer not just the senior vice president position, but the autonomy to build an entire biotechnology division from the ground up. I would have full authority to hire my own team, establish research priorities, and develop partnerships with academic institutions. It was essentially an opportunity to recreate Phoenix Innovations within the framework of a much larger and better-funded organization. Additionally, Elena continued, we're prepared to offer a signing bonus of $2 million and guaranteed equity participation that could be worth significantly more than your annual salary if our biotechnology initiatives succeed. The numbers were staggering, but what really captured my attention was the creative control she was offering. This wasn't just a high-paying job. It was a chance to shape the future of pharmaceutical development on a scale that would have been impossible with my previous company. After I ended the call, David and I sat in our living room staring at each other across the coffee table that had once seemed like a comfortable piece of furniture, but now felt like a barrier between two people trying to figure out if they still belonged in the same life. Sarah, David said finally, I need to tell you something. When Elena Rodriguez walked into that conference room this morning and I saw the way you looked at those research documents, I realized I'd never seen that expression on your face before. You were completely alive in a way that you never are when we're discussing my business or our social obligations. The observation was more perceptive than I'd given him credit for. David had always been good at reading people in professional contexts. Apparently, he'd just never applied those skills to understanding his own wife. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about me needing you to be smaller so I could feel bigger. I don't want to be that kind of husband, and I don't want us to have that kind of marriage. The words carried genuine remorse, but they also raised the question of whether awareness would be enough to change patterns that had been established over 5 years of marriage. People don't transform overnight, and marriages don't suddenly become equitable just because both parties recognize their dysfunction. David, I said carefully, I appreciate you saying that. But if I take this position with Sterling Global, everything about our life together changes. I'll be traveling, working long hours, making decisions that affect millions of dollars in research funding. Can you honestly tell me you're prepared for that? He was quiet for a long time, considering the implications of what I was asking. Finally, he looked directly at me with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. I don't know if I'm prepared for it, but I know I'm not prepared to lose you because I was too insecure to let you be who you really are. The admission marked a turning point in our conversation, but it also highlighted how much work we would need to do to rebuild our relationship on more honest foundations. Trust that had been eroded over years couldn't be restored with a single conversation, no matter how sincere. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. The NSF position application deadline is next week, just saying. I showed David the message, and he read it with the focused attention he usually reserved for important business documents. "The National Science Foundation opportunity?" he asked. "Sarah, that's incredible. Leading a $30 million research initiative would put you at the forefront of biotechnology development." His enthusiasm seemed genuine, but I could also see him processing the implications of having a wife whose professional achievements would far exceed his own. The old David might have found subtle ways to undermine my confidence or suggest that the opportunity was too demanding. This version seemed to be making a conscious effort to be supportive, even if it clearly required effort. "There's something else we need to discuss," I said, knowing that complete honesty was the only path forward. "If I return to biotechnology, whether with Elena or the NSF or someone else, I'm not going to hide my success to protect your ego. I'm not going to downplay my achievements or pretend that my work isn't important. If we're going to make this marriage work, you need to be genuinely proud of having a successful wife, not just tolerant of it." David nodded slowly, understanding that I was establishing non-negotiable terms for our future together. "I want to be proud of you," he said. "I want to be the kind of husband who celebrates your success instead of feeling threatened by it. But Sarah, I'm also going to need your patience while I figure out how to do that." The honesty in his response gave me hope, but it also made me realize how much emotional labor would be required to rebuild our relationship. I would need to trust that his commitment to change was genuine, while he would need to do the actual work of confronting his own insecurities and unconscious biases. Over the following week, our house became a hub of professional activity in ways it had never been before. Elena Rodriguez scheduled a follow-up meeting where she brought her entire biotechnology development team to discuss the scope of the division I would potentially lead. The NSF sent a formal application packet for the research director position. 3 other companies requested consultations about specific pharmaceutical development challenges. David watched this transformation of our domestic space with fascination, and I suspected some bewilderment. He was seeing me in professional mode for the first time, observing how I interacted with scientific colleagues and handled complex technical discussions. The woman who emerged during these meetings was confident, authoritative, and intellectually commanding in ways that bore little resemblance to the supportive wife he'd known. During one particularly intense video conference with Elena's team about regulatory compliance strategies, I caught David standing in the doorway of my improvised home office, listening to me explain pharmaceutical development protocols with the expertise of someone who'd spent decades mastering these concepts. When the call ended, he approached with an expression that mixed admiration with something that might have been regret. "I had no idea," he said simply. "Sarah, listening to you discuss biotechnology is like discovering that I've been married to a completely different person. You're brilliant in ways I never recognized." The comment revealed how thoroughly he'd compartmentalized his understanding of my capabilities. He'd known I had advanced degrees and previous business experience, but he'd never connected that knowledge to actual intellectual capacity. In his mind, I'd been someone who'd had a career, rather than someone who was inherently gifted at scientific thinking. "This is who I've always been," I told him. "This is the person you met 5 years ago, before you convinced me that being this person was somehow incompatible with being your wife." David absorbed this truth with visible discomfort, perhaps recognizing the role he'd played in my professional disappearance. "I don't know how to apologize for not seeing you clearly," he said. But I'm seeing you now, and I understand why Elena Rodriguez was so impressed. The acknowledgement was important, but it also raised questions about the foundation of our relationship. Had David fallen in love with me or with his idea of who I should be? Could a marriage survive the discovery that both partners had been operating under fundamental misconceptions about each other? 2 weeks after that transformative morning in the Glass Tower conference room, I found myself standing in Elena Rodriguez's office in the Sterling Global headquarters, looking out at the Seattle skyline while contemplating the most significant career decision of my life. Elena had flown in from New York specifically to finalize the terms of my employment, and the contract sitting on her desk represented everything I'd thought I'd given up when I married David. Dr. Chen, Elena said, settling into the chair across from me, I want you to know that this offer isn't just about your technical expertise, though that's obviously considerable. I'm interested in hiring you because I believe you understand something that many brilliant scientists miss: the importance of translating research into practical applications that can actually help people. Her observation touched on something that had always motivated my work in biotechnology. The pharmaceutical industry was filled with brilliant researchers who could solve complex theoretical problems, but struggled to navigate the practical challenges of bringing new treatments to market. My success had come from bridging that gap, finding ways to accelerate the development process without compromising safety or efficacy. If I accept this position, I said, I want to establish a fellowship program for young scientists who are interested in regulatory science. Too many brilliant minds avoid this field because they think it's less intellectually challenging than pure research. Elena smiled with obvious approval. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking I was hoping for. Build whatever program you think will advance the field. You'll have full budget authority and complete autonomy. The level of trust and authority she was offering was intoxicating after years of professional invisibility. This wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to shape the future of pharmaceutical development while mentoring the next generation of scientists. When I returned home that evening, David was waiting in the living room with 2 glasses of wine and an expression that combined nervousness with something that might have been pride. Did you sign the contract? He asked. I did, I confirmed, accepting the wine and settling into the chair across from him. David, I start in 6 weeks. This is really happening. He raised his glass in a toast, his smile genuine despite the uncertainty I could see in his eyes. To Dr. Sarah Chen, my brilliant wife who's about to revolutionize biotechnology development. The toast marked a moment of transition, not just in my career, but in our marriage. We were entering uncharted territory, where I would be the more successful partner, where my professional achievements would overshadow his, where the dynamics that had governed our relationship for 5 years would be permanently altered. Over the months that followed, as I built Sterling Global's biotechnology division from the ground up, David and I slowly learned how to be married to each other as complete people, rather than the edited versions we'd presented during our courtship. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I could see him struggling with his own insecurity, times when my professional success clearly triggered his competitive instincts. But there were also moments of genuine partnership, when he celebrated my achievements without reservation and offered support that felt authentic rather than dutiful. The marriage we built during this period was more honest and more complicated than what we'd had before. But it was also stronger because it was based on accepting each other as we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. The morning Elena Rodriguez had asked for my autograph marked the beginning of my return to myself. But it also revealed that the person I'd been hiding wasn't just a successful scientist. She was someone who refused to accept limitations imposed by other people's discomfort with her capabilities. She was someone who believed her work could make a meaningful difference in the world. She was someone who deserved to be seen and valued for who she really was. 6 months after joining Sterling Global, I received a call from the Journal of Biotechnology Innovation requesting an interview about my transition back to active research. During that conversation, the journalist asked what advice I would give to other women who'd stepped away from demanding careers for family reasons. Don't lose yourself in the process of loving someone else, I said. A relationship that requires you to diminish your own potential isn't love. It's control disguised as care.
The words captured something I'd learned through the painful process of reclaiming my professional identity. Marriage should make both partners stronger, not require one person to weaken themselves for the other's comfort. Love should expand your possibilities, not limit them. As I hung up the phone and returned to reviewing research proposals for Sterling Global's latest pharmaceutical initiative, I thought about that morning when I'd been asked to serve coffee at what I thought was my husband's business meeting. The woman who'd quietly acquiesced to that request felt like a stranger now, someone I'd been in another lifetime. The woman I was now wouldn't serve coffee to anyone unless she wanted to. She wouldn't hide her expertise to protect someone else's ego. She wouldn't pretend to be smaller than she was for the sake of keeping peace in a relationship that was built on fundamental dishonesty. That transformation hadn't been easy, and it had required both David and me to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our marriage. But it had also led me back to work that challenged and fulfilled me, to a professional identity that aligned with my values and capabilities. Most importantly, it had taught me that authenticity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself, about who you are and what you deserve. It's about refusing to accept limitations that aren't based on your actual capabilities, but on other people's comfort with your success. The autograph Elena Rodriguez had requested that morning wasn't just my signature on a piece of paper. It was recognition of expertise that I'd almost allowed to disappear entirely. It was acknowledgement that Dr. Sarah Chen had always existed, even when she'd been temporarily hidden behind the facade of the perfect corporate wife. Now she was back, and she wasn't going anywhere. 1 year later, I stood in the gleaming lobby of Sterling Global's newly expanded Seattle campus, watching a group of young scientists file into the auditorium for the inaugural lecture of the Chen Fellowship Program. The fellowship I'd established had attracted some of the brightest minds in biotechnology, researchers who were passionate about bridging the gap between laboratory discoveries and real-world medical applications. The irony wasn't lost on me that the program bore my name, the same name that David had been completely unfamiliar with when Elena Rodriguez first mentioned it in that conference room. Dr. Sarah Chen had become a recognized figure in biotechnology circles again, but more importantly, she'd become someone I was proud to be. David appeared beside me, straightening his tie with the nervous energy he always displayed before important events. Today marked the official launch of Sterling Global's biotechnology division, and the press conference would be covered by major science and business publications. For the first time in our marriage, David would be attending a professional event as the supporting spouse, rather than the other way around. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine concern for my well-being rather than anxiety about his own performance. The transformation in his approach to my success had been gradual but unmistakable. He'd learned to celebrate my achievements without feeling diminished by them, though I knew it remained a conscious effort. "I think so," I replied, adjusting the blazer I'd chosen for the press conference. It felt strange to be the center of attention after years of standing quietly in the background, but it also felt right in a way that surprised me with its intensity. The auditorium was packed with journalists, industry professionals, and academic researchers who'd come to hear about Sterling Global's ambitious plans for pharmaceutical development. Elena Rodriguez took the podium first, outlining the company's investment in biotechnology and introducing me as the architect of their new initiative. When my turn came to speak, I found myself looking out at an audience that included some of the most respected names in biotechnology research. These were people whose work I'd followed and admired throughout my career, and now they were here to listen to my vision for the future of pharmaceutical development. "The biotechnology industry stands at a crossroads," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. "We have the scientific knowledge to develop revolutionary treatments, but we're often hampered by inefficient regulatory processes and poor communication between researchers and regulatory agencies." I went on to outline the Sterling Global Biotechnology Division's approach to streamlining pharmaceutical development without compromising safety standards. The fellowship program would train the next generation of regulatory scientists, while our research initiatives would focus on developing new methodologies for accelerating drug approval processes. As I spoke, I caught sight of David in the audience, his expression one of genuine pride and admiration. This was the man who had once suggested that my stress levels from biotechnology work were unhealthy for our marriage. Now he was watching me command the attention of industry leaders with obvious satisfaction in my success. The question and answer session that followed the presentation was intense, with journalists and researchers probing the details of our research
Methodology and regulatory strategies. I found myself energized by the intellectual challenge, drawing on years of expertise that had been dormant but never lost. One question came from Dr. Amanda Foster, a researcher I'd collaborated with during my Phoenix Innovations days. Dr. Chen, you've been away from active biotechnology research for several years. What inspired your return to the field, and how has that hiatus affected your perspective on pharmaceutical development? The question touched on something I'd been reflecting on throughout the past year. My time away from biotechnology hadn't been wasted, even though it had often felt like professional exile. The experience of stepping back from my career had given me insights into work-life balance and sustainable research practices that I might never have gained otherwise. Sometimes stepping away from something you love gives you a clearer perspective on what really matters, I replied. My hiatus allowed me to think about biotechnology development from a broader perspective, considering not just the scientific challenges, but the human factors that affect research productivity and regulatory compliance. The response seemed to resonate with the audience, many of whom had probably struggled with similar questions about career sustainability and personal fulfillment in demanding fields. After the press conference, Elena Rodriguez hosted a reception for industry colleagues and potential research partners. I found myself engaged in animated discussions about regulatory science and pharmaceutical development, conversations that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this field in the first place. Rachel Thompson appeared beside me during a brief lull in conversations, her expression mixing pride with a hint of vindication. "I told you so," she said simply, her smile taking any sting out of the words. "This is who you've always been, Sarah. I'm just glad you finally remembered." Her presence at the event meant everything to me. Rachel had been the one person who'd consistently refused to accept my professional disappearance, who'd kept pushing me to recognize my own worth even when I had been determined to minimize it. David joined our conversation, and I watched with fascination as he and Rachel discussed my work with genuine enthusiasm. There had been a time when David barely tolerated Rachel's presence, perhaps sensing her disapproval of how our marriage had diminished my professional ambitions. Now they seemed to have found common ground in their shared appreciation for my return to biotechnology. The three of us were interrupted by Michael Torres, Elena's assistant, who approached with a tablet displaying social media mentions of the press conference. "Dr. Chen," he said with obvious excitement, "you're trending on LinkedIn and Twitter. The biotechnology community is calling this one of the most significant industry developments of the year." The immediate positive response was gratifying, but what struck me most was how natural it felt to be receiving this kind of professional recognition again. For years, I'd convinced myself that I didn't miss the acknowledgement and respect that came with expertise, but apparently I'd been lying to myself about that as well. As the reception wound down, Elena approached David and me with a proposal that would test the strength of our rebuilt marriage in ways we hadn't anticipated. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I've just received a call from our European partners. They're requesting that you spend 6 months in London leading the expansion of our biotechnology initiatives into the UK market." The opportunity was exactly the kind of international assignment that would have been impossible during my previous marriage dynamics. David would need to relocate temporarily or accept a long-distance arrangement while I established Sterling Global's European operations. I looked at David, trying to read his expression as he processed this unexpected development. The old David might have found reasons why the assignment was too disruptive to our life together, too demanding on our relationship. This David seemed to be genuinely considering the logistics rather than looking for excuses to discourage me. "When would this start?" David asked Elena, his tone businesslike rather than defensive. "Ideally, within the next 3 months," Elena replied. "We're moving quickly to establish our presence in the European market before competitors gain too much ground." David turned to me with an expression that was both supportive and slightly anxious. "Sarah, this sounds like an incredible opportunity. How do you feel about it?" The question revealed how much our communication patterns had changed. Instead of telling me how he felt about the opportunity and waiting for me to agree, he was asking for my perspective first.
It was a small shift, but it represented a fundamental change in how we approached decisions that affected both of us. "I'm interested," I said honestly. "Leading international expansion would be a new challenge, and working with European regulatory agencies could provide valuable insights for our domestic operations." "Then we'll figure out how to make it work," David said simply. "Maybe this is a good time for Mitchell and Associates to explore European consulting opportunities." His willingness to adapt his own career plans to support mine was a reversal of our historical dynamic that felt both foreign and deeply appreciated. We were learning to be partners in the truest sense, both willing to make sacrifices for the other's professional growth. Over the following weeks, as we planned for the London assignment, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from serving coffee at business meetings to leading international biotechnology initiatives. The transformation hadn't been linear or easy, but it had taught me valuable lessons about authenticity, self-advocacy, and the importance of refusing to accept limitations that weren't based on actual capabilities. The most surprising discovery had been that David was capable of growth and change in ways I hadn't expected. The man who'd once been threatened by my professional success had learned to find genuine pride in being married to someone whose achievements exceeded his own. It hadn't happened overnight, and it had required consistent effort from both of us, but our marriage had emerged stronger and more honest than it had been before the estrangement. 3 weeks before my departure for London, we attended a biotechnology industry gala where I was scheduled to receive an award for innovation in regulatory science. As we walked into the ballroom at the Four Seasons, I was struck by how different this felt from the corporate events we'd attended during the early years of our marriage. Then I was David's accessory, the attractive and accomplished wife who enhanced his professional image without competing for attention. Now, David was my supportive spouse, genuinely proud to be married to someone whose achievements exceeded his own, associated with my success, and comfortable with the reality that most people in the room were there to see me rather than him. The award presentation was a highlight of the evening, but what meant more to me was seeing the genuine pleasure on David's face as industry leaders congratulated him on being married to such a remarkable scientist. He'd learned to bask in reflected glory rather than feeling threatened by it, and that transformation had liberated both of us from the constraints that had nearly destroyed our marriage. During my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of persistence and authenticity in scientific research. But I also acknowledged the personal journey that had brought me back to active involvement in biotechnology. "Sometimes we lose sight of who we really are," I said, looking out at the audience that included many colleagues who'd known me during my Phoenix Innovations days. "The key is recognizing when we've drifted away from our authentic selves and having the courage to find our way back." The words applied to more than just my professional journey. Our marriage had also required a return to authenticity and acknowledgement of who we really were, rather than who we'd been pretending to be for the sake of maintaining artificial harmony. After the gala, David and I walked along the Seattle waterfront, the city lights reflecting off Elliott Bay in patterns that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this place. Our conversation drifted from the evening's events to our plans for maintaining our relationship during my London assignment. "Sarah," David said as we paused near Pike Place Market, "I need to tell you something. When Elena Rodriguez first asked for your autograph in that conference room, I felt like my entire world was collapsing. Everything I thought I knew about our marriage suddenly felt like an illusion." His honesty about that difficult period was something we'd both grown more comfortable with over the past year. Our relationship had benefited from acknowledging painful truths rather than pretending they didn't exist. "But now," he continued, "watching you succeed at this level, seeing how fulfilled you are when you're doing work that challenges you, I understand that the illusion was thinking you could be happy being anything less than who you really are." The observation revealed how much his understanding of marriage and partnership had evolved. He'd learned that love meant supporting each other's authentic selves, rather than trying to mold each other into more comfortable versions. As we reached our car, David turned to me with an expression that was both serious and affectionate. "I know the London assignment will be challenging for us, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you for taking it. The world needs more scientists like you, people who can bridge the gap between research and practical application." His support felt genuine in a way that our early relationship interactions never had. We'd moved beyond the superficial encouragement that masked underlying resentment to a deeper appreciation for each other's strengths and ambitions. The morning of my departure for London, I stood in my kitchen making coffee while David finished packing my remaining suitcases. The routine felt both familiar and completely different from our morning preparations during the early years of our marriage. Then, these domestic moments had been colored by unspoken tensions and unacknowledged resentments. Now they felt like genuine partnership. Elena Rodriguez had arranged for a car to take me to the airport, but David insisted on driving me himself. As we made our way through Seattle's morning traffic, we talked about practical matters like communication schedules and visit planning. But underneath those logistics was an emotional foundation that felt much more solid than anything we'd built before. At the departure gate, David hugged me with an intensity that suggested he was still processing the magnitude of the changes in our life together. 6 months ago, the idea of you leading international business initiatives would have terrified me, he admitted. Now it just makes me proud. The confession revealed how much emotional work he had done to address his own insecurities and competitive instincts. Personal growth was never easy, but David had approached the challenge of becoming a more supportive partner with the same determination he brought to his business endeavors. As my flight was called for boarding, I looked back at David standing in the airport terminal and felt a surge of gratitude for the journey we had taken together. The marriage we had now bore little resemblance to the one we'd started with, but it was built on honesty and mutual respect rather than comfortable illusions. The woman boarding that flight to London was Dr. Sarah Chen, biotechnology expert and international consultant, but she was also Sarah Mitchell, wife to a man who'd learned to celebrate her success rather than feel threatened by it. Both identities were authentic, and for the first time in years, they didn't feel like they were in conflict with each other. 6 months later, as I prepared to return to Seattle after successfully establishing Sterling Global's European operations, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that morning when Elena Rodriguez had asked for my autograph. The professional recognition and financial success were gratifying, but what mattered most was the recovery of my authentic self. The woman who had once served coffee at business meetings and hidden her expertise to protect her husband's ego had learned to value her own capabilities and refused to accept artificial limitations. The marriage that had once required one partner to diminish herself for the other's comfort had been rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and genuine support. Most importantly, I'd learned that authenticity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself about what you deserve and refusing to settle for anything less. It's about recognizing your own worth and insisting that others recognize it too. The autograph Elena Rodriguez had requested had been more than just a signature. It had been an acknowledgement of expertise that I'd almost allowed to disappear entirely, a recognition of value that I'd been hiding even from myself. Now, that signature represented not just professional achievement, but the courage to be completely myself, in a world that had often suggested I should be someone smaller. Dr. Sarah Chen was back, and she was exactly where she belonged. 2 years had passed since that transformative morning in the Glass Tower conference room, and I found myself sitting in my corner office at Sterling Global's Seattle headquarters, reviewing applications for the Chen Fellowship Program's third cohort. The view from my windows encompassed the same Seattle skyline that had served as backdrop to my professional resurrection, but everything else about my life had been fundamentally transformed. The morning brought news that would have seemed impossible during my years of domestic invisibility. The Journal of Science had selected me as one of their Innovators Under 45, recognizing my work in regulatory optimization and pharmaceutical development acceleration. The accompanying article would feature a photograph of me in my laboratory, surrounded by the research that was reshaping how biotechnology companies approach drug development. My assistant knocked on the door, announcing that David had arrived for our lunch appointment. These midday meetings had become a regular part of our routine, a way of maintaining connection despite our increasingly demanding professional schedules. David entered my office with the confident bearing of someone who'd grown comfortable navigating spaces where his wife was the person of authority and influence. "Congratulations on the Journal of Science recognition," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with genuine enthusiasm. When I called to make the lunch reservation, they mentioned that several pharmaceutical executives had been trying to get tables this week, hoping to run into you. The idea of industry leaders adjusting their schedules around the possibility of encountering me still felt surreal, but it was becoming an increasingly common occurrence. Dr. Sarah Chen had evolved from a hidden identity into a recognizable figure in biotechnology circles, someone whose opinions carried weight in boardrooms and academic conferences around the world. David's ability to celebrate these developments without feeling diminished had been one of the most remarkable aspects of our relationship's evolution. The man who'd once been threatened by my expertise now took obvious pride in being married to someone whose professional reputation extended far beyond his own social circle. We walked to our favorite restaurant in the University District, a small establishment that had become our regular spot for these weekly lunch meetings. The familiarity of the routine provided stability amid the constant changes that came with my expanding professional responsibilities and international travel schedule. Over pasta and wine, David shared updates from Mitchell & Associates, which had indeed expanded into European consulting as he'd suggested during the planning for my London assignment. His business was thriving partly due to connections he'd made through my biotechnology networks, but also because he'd developed genuine expertise in helping American companies navigate international regulatory environments. "Sarah," David said as we finished our entrees, "I've been thinking about something Elena mentioned at the Sterling Global Board dinner last week. She suggested that you might be interested in starting your own consulting firm again, potentially with backing from Sterling Global as a strategic partner." The possibility had been percolating in my mind for months. While I loved my work at Sterling Global, the entrepreneurial itch that had driven me to build Phoenix Innovations was beginning to reassert itself. The idea of creating something new, of having complete autonomy over research directions and strategic partnerships held enormous appeal. "What do you think about that prospect?" David continued. "From a practical standpoint, the timing might be ideal. You've reestablished your reputation in the biotechnology community, you have extensive industry connections, and Sterling Global's backing would provide financial security during the startup phase." His analysis was characteristically thorough, but what struck me most was his assumption that the decision was mine to make. The old David might have found reasons to discourage such a venture, concerns about risk or stability that masked his discomfort with my independence. This version was helping me think through the strategic implications of a choice he clearly supported. "I've been considering it," I admitted. "There are research directions I'd like to explore that don't align perfectly with Sterling Global's current priorities. Having my own firm would allow me to pursue those interests while potentially creating more significant impact in regulatory science." David nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of time frame are you thinking about? And would this be based in Seattle? Or would international expansion be part of the initial strategy?" The questions revealed how much his understanding of my professional ambitions had deepened. He was thinking like a true business partner, someone invested in helping me succeed rather than finding obstacles to my plans. Our conversation was interrupted by Dr. Amanda Foster, the researcher who'd questioned me during the Sterling Global press conference 2 years ago. She approached our table with the excitement of someone who'd just made an important discovery. "Sarah, I'm so glad I ran into you," Amanda said, barely acknowledging David in her enthusiasm. "I just heard about the Journal of Science recognition, and I wanted to tell you about something that might interest you. The European Medicines Agency is looking for an independent consultant to lead a comprehensive review of pharmaceutical approval processes. The contract is worth $15 million over 3 years, and I immediately thought of you. The opportunity was exactly the kind of high-profile, high-impact project that could establish the foundation for a new consulting firm. Leading a review of European pharmaceutical regulations would position me as a global authority on regulatory optimization, while providing the financial resources to build a world-class research team." After Amanda left, David and I sat in contemplative silence, both processing the implications of what we'd just heard. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it would also require me to spend significant time in Europe and potentially relocate operations across multiple continents. "That sounds like the kind of project that could define the next phase of your career," David said finally. "Are you interested in pursuing it?" The question was asked without any underlying agenda or attempt to influence my decision. David had learned to trust my judgment about professional opportunities and to support choices that aligned with my goals rather than his comfort level. "I've been considering it," I admitted. "There are research directions I'd like to explore that don't align perfectly with Sterling Global's current priorities. Having my own firm would allow me to pursue those interests while potentially creating more significant impact in regulatory science." David nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of time frame are you thinking about? And would this be based in Seattle? Or would international expansion be part of the initial strategy?
Married to someone more successful than me, now you're being recruited for projects that could reshape international pharmaceutical regulation. I'm not going to be the reason you turn down opportunities like that. His words captured the essence of our transformation as a couple. We'd moved from a relationship based on maintaining artificial equilibrium to one that could accommodate growth and change, even when those changes created temporary challenges or uncertainties. Over the following weeks, I found myself in extensive negotiations with the European Medicines Agency about the scope and structure of the regulatory review project. Elena Rodriguez, true to her supportive nature, not only endorsed my pursuit of independent consulting, but offered Sterling Global as a potential strategic partner in the new venture. The conversations with European regulators were intellectually stimulating in ways that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this field. The pharmaceutical approval process was a complex system that balanced public safety with innovation incentives, and the opportunity to optimize that balance on an international scale was exactly the kind of challenge that energized me. David threw himself into supporting the transition with characteristic thoroughness. He researched international business formation requirements, connected me with attorneys who specialized in global consulting arrangements, and even began exploring ways that Mitchell and Associates could potentially support my European operations. His enthusiasm for my success had become so genuine that I sometimes marveled at the distance we'd traveled from our original dynamic. The man who'd once suggested that my career stress was unhealthy for our marriage was now actively strategizing about how to maximize my professional impact on a global scale. 3 months after my conversation with Amanda Foster, I found myself sitting in Elena Rodriguez's office, signing the final documents that would establish Chen Regulatory Solutions as an independent consulting firm with Sterling Global as a founding strategic partner. The financial backing was substantial enough to attract top-tier talent, while the partnership structure maintained my autonomy over research directions and client relationships. Elena watched me sign the papers with obvious satisfaction. "Dr. Chen," she said, "when I first met you in that conference room 2 years ago, I suspected you were exactly the kind of visionary leader the biotechnology industry needed. I'm proud to be supporting your next chapter." Her words reminded me of how much had changed since that morning when I'd been asked to serve coffee at what I thought was David's business meeting. The woman signing these documents was confident in her expertise, comfortable with her authority, and excited about the impact she could make through her work. The launch of Chen Regulatory Solutions attracted significant attention from biotechnology and pharmaceutical publications. The firm's mission statement emphasized accelerating life-saving drug development through innovative regulatory strategies while maintaining the highest standards of safety and efficacy. Within the first month, we received consulting requests from major pharmaceutical companies, academic research institutions, and government agencies. David attended the official launch event as my proudest supporter, introducing himself to industry leaders as Sarah's husband with obvious pleasure rather than discomfort. Watching him navigate conversations about my work with genuine enthusiasm, I was struck by how thoroughly he'd embraced his role as the spouse of a successful entrepreneur. The European Medicines Agency project officially began 6 months later, requiring me to establish operations in London while maintaining our Seattle headquarters. David had arranged his own schedule to spend approximately half his time in Europe, both to support my work and to develop Mitchell & Associates' international consulting practice. Our first evening in our London apartment, an elegant space in Kensington that would serve as my European base of operations, David and I sat by the windows overlooking Hyde Park, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. "Do you ever think about that morning when Elena Rodriguez asked for your autograph?" David asked, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if she hadn't recognized you, if your expertise had remained hidden indefinitely." The question touched on something I'd contemplated many times during our transformation.
What if Elena Rodriguez hadn't been familiar with my work? What if I'd continued living as the invisible wife, gradually losing touch with my professional identity until it disappeared entirely? I think we would have eventually faced a crisis anyway, I replied. Living as half a person isn't sustainable indefinitely. The resentment and frustration would have built up until something forced us to confront the problems in our relationship. David nodded thoughtfully. I'm grateful it happened the way it did, he said. Having Elena recognize your expertise forced both of us to acknowledge truths we'd been avoiding. I needed to see you in your professional element to understand what I'd been asking you to sacrifice. His insight revealed how much emotional intelligence he'd developed through our marital reconstruction. The process hadn't been easy for either of us, but it had ultimately created a partnership based on authentic understanding rather than comfortable illusions. The European Medicines Agency project progressed over 18 months, during which my team developed new frameworks for pharmaceutical approval that could potentially reduce development timelines by 2 to 3 years while maintaining rigorous safety standards. The work attracted attention from regulatory agencies around the world, establishing Chen Regulatory Solutions as a global leader in pharmaceutical policy optimization. Throughout this period, David and I maintained our marriage across 2 continents, learning to sustain intimacy and partnership despite demanding travel schedules and professional pressures. The relationship that emerged from this testing was stronger and more flexible than anything we'd built during our years of artificial domestic harmony. One evening in our London apartment, as I reviewed the final report for the European Medicines Agency, David approached with a bottle of champagne and an expression that mixed excitement with nervousness. "Sarah," he said, settling beside me on the sofa, "I have something to tell you. Mitchell and Associates has been invited to submit a proposal for a major consulting contract with the European Union's Trade Development Initiative. It's a 3-year project that would establish me as a significant player in international business consulting." The opportunity was clearly important to him, but I could see he was
concerned about how it might affect our relationship dynamics. His success would be substantial, though still overshadowed by my own professional achievements, and I suspected he was worried about how I would react to his growing independence and ambition. "David, that's incredible," I said, genuinely excited for him. "Tell me about the scope of the project and what it would mean for your career." His relief at my enthusiastic response was palpable, and I realized that some part of him had been afraid I might feel threatened by his success in the way he'd once felt threatened by mine. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, but it also demonstrated how much we'd both learned about supporting each other's professional growth. As he described the consulting opportunity, I found myself experiencing the same pride in his achievements that he'd learned to feel about mine. We'd both become more successful individuals, but more importantly, we'd become genuine partners in each other's ambitions, rather than competitors for attention or validation. The final evening of my European Medicines Agency project, I stood in the organization's Brussels headquarters, delivering a presentation to pharmaceutical industry leaders and government officials from across the European Union. The recommendations my team had developed would potentially accelerate life-saving drug development for millions of patients, while maintaining the stringent safety standards that protected public health. As I concluded my presentation to sustained applause, I caught sight of David in the audience, his expression radiating pride and admiration. The man who'd once been uncomfortable with my professional expertise was now my most enthusiastic supporter, someone who understood that my success enhanced rather than threatened our partnership. After the presentation, Elena Rodriguez approached with news that would shape the next phase of my career. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I've just received calls from pharmaceutical regulators in Japan, Australia, and Canada. They're all interested in adapting your European framework to their approval processes. Chen Regulatory Solutions is about to become truly global." The expansion possibilities were thrilling, but they also raised questions about the sustainability of maintaining such an extensive international presence while preserving the marriage David and I had worked so hard to rebuild.
That evening, in our hotel suite overlooking the Brussels skyline, David and I discussed the implications of further global expansion. The conversation revealed how much our communication patterns had evolved since those early days when major decisions had been made unilaterally without considering the other's perspective. Sarah, David said, I know this global expansion represents an incredible opportunity for Chen Regulatory Solutions. I also know it will require significant travel and potentially establishing operations on multiple continents. I want you to pursue whatever path excites you most, but I'd like us to think together about how to structure our life to support both our ambitions. His approach to the conversation was collaborative rather than controlling, focused on finding solutions rather than creating obstacles. We'd learned to be strategic partners in each other's success rather than competitors for attention or priority. Over the course of several hours, we developed a framework for managing international operations while maintaining our relationship's stability. David's own consulting practice had grown sufficiently successful that he could establish satellite offices in key markets, allowing us to coordinate our travel and maintain regular personal connection despite demanding professional schedules. 6 months later, I stood in my Seattle office, now the global headquarters of Chen Regulatory Solutions, reviewing quarterly reports from our operations in London, Brussels, Tokyo, and Sydney. The firm had grown to employ 47 researchers and consultants, all focused on optimizing pharmaceutical regulatory processes to accelerate life-saving drug development. The work was intellectually challenging and socially meaningful in ways that fulfilled every aspect of my professional ambitions. But perhaps more importantly, I'd learned to pursue those ambitions without compromising my authentic self or accepting artificial limitations imposed by others' discomfort with my capabilities. David knocked on my office door, announcing that our car had arrived for the Biotechnology Industry Awards ceremony, where I would be receiving the International Excellence in Regulatory Science Award. As we rode through Seattle's evening traffic toward the event venue, I reflected on the transformation that had brought me from serving coffee at business meetings to leading global initiatives that could reshape pharmaceutical development. The woman accepting that award would be Dr. Sarah Chen, but she would also be Sarah Mitchell, wife to a man who'd learned to celebrate her success rather than feel threatened by it. Both identities were authentic, and for the first time in my adult life, they existed in perfect harmony. As we walked into the award ceremony together, David took my hand with obvious pride. The gesture was simple, but it represented everything we'd learned about love, partnership, and the courage to be completely ourselves in a world that often suggested we should be someone smaller. That autograph Elena Rodriguez had requested 3 years earlier had been more than just recognition of professional expertise. It had been the beginning of my return to authentic self-expression, the first step in reclaiming an identity I'd almost allowed to disappear entirely. Now, that signature appeared on research papers that were changing international pharmaceutical policy, on consulting contracts that accelerated life-saving drug development, and on awards that recognized contributions to human health and scientific progress. But most importantly, it represented the courage to be exactly who I was meant to be, without apology or compromise. Dr. Sarah Chen was exactly where she belonged, and she was never going away again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.